Well, hello there, and welcome to day 35 of A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. And today I am looking at the 2005 British film Vera Drake. This is my first experience of a Mike Leigh film. Not just for this, because I have previously said, oh, this is my first director, but traditionally I normally mean for this series. But this is genuinely my first experience of a Mike Leigh film. So, as you can imagine, I have some thoughts. Mike Leigh is a British director, particularly known for his improvisational scene structures. That is to say, that rather than traditionally having a written script as one does, he places his actors into a scenario and has them workshop and develop the language of a scene and builds it into the structure of the film, which is quite an intense experience as a viewer. So Vera Drake is set in 1950s England, around a woman named Vera Drake, played by Imelda Staunton. Now, I'm going to do this in two segments. I'm going to talk about Mike Leigh's style and structure and the way that he tells stories and the visual landscape. And then I'm going to talk more about the plot, because I do think that the core of this film really opens with the spoiler aspect of it. And I think it is a shame to immediately spoil the primary structure, the primary plot narrative of the film. But I do want to briefly talk over his style without, beforehand. So as I say, improvisational scenes. What that really comes across as is quite. It is quite a hard thing to sit through, because even the most casual film viewer, someone who watches the occasional film, goes to the cinema once a year, someone who would say they don't even like film, has a cursory understanding of the language of film. That is to say, when you're watching a film, you are not just watching people in real life. Our brains are structured to understand that we are watching a narrative, and it's a question of whether we can trick ourselves or be tricked by the narrative into thinking that it's a form of reality. However, structurally speaking, we know that a character walks into a scene in a certain way, people address each other in a certain way, the exchanging of lines happens in a way that allows us to understand. And if that convention is broken, we think that there is something wrong with the film. That is to say, if people talk over each other when they don't mean to, we think, oh, someone's flubbed a line. If people don't walk into frame in a way that they would traditionally, we think, oh, there is something wrong with the cinematography. Mike Leigh is definitely an experimenter in that respect, because he clearly knows the correct framing of shots. He knows the structure of dialogues. He knows how his scenes need to begin and end. But he, at the same time, wants to experiment and expand and test what that exactly means in terms of what we're seeing. I said something very similar about the Merowitz stories, and even though I haven't reviewed it in this series, I had a very similar feeling with the Adam Sandler film Uncut Gems, where it's very much trying to make conversations more naturalist and social realist. That's to say, people don't talk in dialogues. We talk over each other. We talk in ways that means that we are listening, but we aren't stopping to listen, and people will respond with not that interesting information or useful information in a conversation, and lead to dead ends and all sorts of conversational quirks that you wouldn't get in a traditional film script because they're clunky, they're weird, and people's brains are wired to look at something like that and say, well, how does this service the greater narrative? What Mike Leigh does beyond the the Mirror stories, the Uncut Gems, is he, like I say, is even pushing it with the cinematography. There are scenes in Vera Drake where the framing of the shot is not how you would traditionally look at a scene. There are scenes where you feel as an audience member like you're in the corner of the room and you're only seeing a certain proportion, a certain section of the full room in front of you, which isn't traditional. You see people from odd angles. In a way, particularly I think in scenes where you're in, say, people's bedrooms, or you're in sort of more intimate, closed-in spaces, the camera work seems to be sat or move in a way that you wouldn't expect, or you wouldn't be looking in the right way. Now, saying that, in the same film, there are incredibly cinematic shots, in a very social realist sense. Like I say, Mike Leigh is very much in that same gritty, urban British drama style, where we have a shot of someone's face as they're reacting to information, and you see, a real sort of ugliness in them. And it's not like because they are ugly, but it is a tradition, I suppose. And I don't see it as much in American filmmaking as you do in British, although thinking about it, it does extend into European and East Asian cinema, where you can see this. But the camera will frame people in a way that makes them look less attractive because they're pulling a face or they're reacting, and it gives them this gritty, realist look to them that you would see in a normal person, a normal everyday person, but you don't traditionally see in a Hollywood film, because the cameras function in, say, your big American blockbusters is to make everyone even look almost their best selves, or to frame something in its best way, even if it is something like a battle scene or something. Whereas this makes people, it gives it this sort of washed out sense sometimes, this sense of as if someone genuinely hasn't had their hair and makeup done, but they have literally just walked onto set and are being filmed. And of course they have, but it's being framed and shot in a way that makes them look more real, and it gives it this more visceral sense. I think and in terms of the setting as well, so it's set in 1950s Britain, and it really does capture a aesthetic. You do really get a sense of being in a 1950s home. And again, I think this improvised dialogue structure, this way that it's shot, the way that scenes are dressed, they are very cluttered. You feel like you're in people's homes, and there is something almost claustrophobic about it, where you're in these small spaces with lots of people, lots going on. Props are moving all over the place, people are talking all over each other, and it does feel like you're in an intimate space, and it triggers that sense of intimacy, that sense of like claustrophobia, that sense of, oh, I'm actually in a 1950s home, which feeds into the realism of it. I'm going to now veer more into the actual narrative of it, because I think this will feed into what I've been saying. So I am going to say the main plot drive, the story that surrounds Vera Drake herself, and is at the core of the narrative, which is Vera Drake is a traditional 1950s housewife, mother. She works in cleaning jobs, but she, on the side, is a backstreet abortionist. As I say, it is a tough subject matter to depict, because there is a level of intimacy that you have to go to and vulnerability that is quite difficult to do in traditional filmmaking. The way that it plays out is that we get scenes where Vera will just go into someone's home and perform the procedure, trying to talk to them, trying to calm them down, sometimes failing completely to really put them at their ease, but she knows what she's doing. And she knows how to perform the procedure as they did back then. And you get hints to other things, someone will react to someone outside, someone will burst into tears, and it has this real sense of authenticity to it, that there's no... Traditionally, you might think, oh, this is the point in which someone cries, or this is the point in which someone breaks down, but because of the way that these scenes are structured, when someone starts going to pieces, or let's say someone is saying goodbye to, Vera's done her procedure and is about to leave, and they react to something, because we've been put in this more vulnerable setting with them, and we are also made to feel vulnerable because of the things that I have mentioned, their reactions feel more authentic, feel just that little bit more visceral. And we don't always know, in fact we very seldomly know the stories of a lot of the women that Vera visits, and so we just get this sense of, there could be a multitude of reasons why each woman is having her procedure, but it is just part of everyday life. And that's something else that this film does, and I understand Mike Leigh does, is he likes to film, I suppose for lack of a better term, mundanity. He likes that sense of the everyday, what people do in their jobs, what they do at home, how they spend their social time, how they interact with each other, and then you have the plot somewhere amongst it. And what that really helps with this is it feeds into the fact that Vera, at this point, from what we understand, has been doing this procedure for decades, and she's so used to it that it is just part of her everyday routine, unbeknownst to any of her family members. But what we experience, because we're given, not a traditional narrative, not essential information, we are just being given snatches of different bits, and we're being given, sequences of people just spending time together or going out dancing, is you do connect to the characters in a way that you wouldn't necessarily think you could without getting to know them in a more traditional way. That is to say, there are the characters that are amongst Vera are her husband, her grown-up son, her grown-up daughter, a young man who they brought round to the house, and her husband's brother and his wife. And in some respects, we don't really get to know them in a plot sense. We don't, we know fragments of information that they tell us because of conversations they have, but we don't know them in a way that a narrative would, where it explains who they are, what their role is, how they feel about everything. You only really get a sense of how people feel by how they react to each other in the scene. in terms of like internalized narrative, you only really get Vera's internal experience. Well, her and one other character, which is Sally Hawkins, a young Sally Hawkins, plays a richer woman, or a woman from a wealthier family, who is a man assaults her, and consequently she needs to have an abortion. However, she goes through the traditional method. If there is a major weakness in the film, it's her plotline, because we are shown her going through the steps that one does to have that procedure done within the letter of the law, per se, of the time. However, we, strangely, after a few scenes, I'd say maybe after the end of the first act, maybe up to the halfway point of the film, we see her go through those early stages, and then we don't see her character again, ever. She never interacts with Vera or any of the main narrative. It almost feels like it's supposed to be a demonstration of how the process of abortion would go more, if you have the wealth and the ability to go through the procedure traditionally, in contrast to how many of these girls have to have the procedure done via, through Vera. But that plot doesn't really go anywhere, and you do spend a fair amount of time with Sally Hawkins, and as I say, she is one of her, Vera, and maybe one or two others. Vera's husband, I'm thinking. She's one of the characters who you spend sort of intimate time with, as in by herself. You spend time as a viewer starting to connect to her, and it doesn't go anywhere. I think Mike Leigh's style is quite an intense sit. I struggled to begin with because, like everyone, I'm used to a traditional narrative structure. I'm used to scripts, and as someone who works, who's performed using scripts and broken those scripts down, I have a greater expectation, I suppose, of what I'm seeing, and so I definitely struggled early on with this more fluid sense of scene transitions, of interactions where you don't get told information, you simply are just following characters, and then it starts to unpack. And I think a lot of audience will struggle with that. I think you have to kind of go in knowing that you will adapt to it, but then at the same time, I think some people just will find it difficult. But I do think it's worthwhile. I do think that Mike Leigh's style, as I said, really gives it a visceral authenticity to it. And I think that when you do connect to the characters and when things do happen to them, as you get into the later parts of the film, and there is nothing, with the exception of a climax point in which, without going into too much detail, it's set around the dinner table when a major event happens. The rest of it is very mundane. It is very much what you would imagine the process of, the everyday activities of Vera, the process of what she does, and then the political and constabulary oversight and how they react to the consequences. But it's portrayed almost as if it's documentary, in terms of this is how people would react, this is how the procedure would be done, and it is very procedural in that respect. I'm intrigued to see more Mike Leigh films, to see how his style applies to different storytelling. and this is definitely an eye-opener from a filmmaking perspective. So, yeah, I'm very intrigued by this going forward. I must admit, and again, I can see why Imelda Staunton was given the BAFTA for Best Actress, and why Mike Leigh won Best Director at the time, because this is an extraordinary film. As I say, I've not seen many films, if any, like this. So I can see why it would get the acknowledgement that it is, and nominated for Best Original Screenplay, which is odd because one could make the question of, like, what screenplay? But that set aside, I do think that the film is, as I say, extraordinary. Anyway, thanks for joining me. I'll see you again tomorrow. Take care.